in the global politics when it comes to their political position as well as security. So number one, North Korea. So we say that North Korea, it has been in the past not responding to things like, no thank you, soft negotiation power. They have always been only responding to brute force. This means that all the negotiations that have been undergone towards North Korea have been largely futile. They have a lot of death camps for people who don't celebrate Kim Jong-un's grandmother's birthday and and things like that. But they have responded to brute force when it comes to crippling sanctions by United States and its allies, and have opened up gates in order for humanitarian aid to enter. Why? Because those are the only things that threaten Kim Jong-un's political power as well as position of power. That means that, secondly, also, there's also things that deter North Korea from entering South Korea are things like American forces that have actively around that area. That means that North Korea has been actually afraid of the size of American forces, right? This means that the only thing that actually makes North Korea afraid are actual show of power. Why do we not get that, and why does this thing change now? We think that as of late, we cannot rely on American support because of the way in which Trump aligned himself with Russia and China. It's unlikely, secondly, more importantly, that North Korea probably don't believe that the United States has in South Korea's back anymore. It's very important to realize that North Korea might want to, might want to attack them or might want to launch nuclear weapons upon them, and don't believe that they will suffer repercussions. We think it's very dangerous for the security of South Korea. In comparative, we think that, number one, if there's, without any support from the United States or its allies, at the very least, South Korea has an independent force if they have nuclear weapons in order to be an independent deterrent against North Korea as well as countries around that area. That means that North Korea is likely to react with more caution. We think it's better if oppositions don't characterize North Korea as just being an irrational actor, but an actor that also has political incentive and respond to things that actually threatens their survivability as well. Things very important. No, thank you. So we also think, secondly, unfortunately, we don't think South Korea can rebuild their military infrastructure to be as effective as the United States or to be as threatening as without a nuclear weapon. This is because for many years they've been largely reliant on United States and don't have a well-equipped army. But having a nuclear weapon, and North Korea having a nuclear weapon means that even if they rebuild those military functions, they still wouldn't be as threatening or as effective. And we also think it takes a long time to rebuild military infrastructure. We think they need to have security right now.
Point of information.
Go ahead.
The one country that, despite his generalist rhetoric, Donald Trump would not withdraw support from is South Korea, for the reason that the countries they're diametrically opposed to, the ones he also is diametrically opposed to, China and North Korea. Why would he do that given his rhetoric on those two specific countries?
Look, so it's very important to realize that the way in which Donald Trump has realigned himself with China has been very different. That means that he's been more open to negotiation and friendly talks, and he isn't even president yet. That means that the moment he steps into power, it's likely that you see a shift in his alliances towards China and Russia, and his shift of alliances out of South Korea. And we don't see a political incentive for him to remain an ally with South Korea. And even if North Korea believes that the United States is shifting their political allies, it's very important to realize that they think of South Korea as less of a threat. Now, thirdly, and more importantly, is that if we have nuclear weapon, we think it's far less likely that President-elect Donald Trump will just drop South Korea just like that. This means that President-elect Donald Trump is more likely to stand by South Korea because they believe, no thank you, I won't be taking any more, that they need, one, a strong ally. Secondly, it disempowered the argument that South Korea is entirely reliant on the United States. This is a very important argument, given that a lot of Donald Trump's voter base believe that the rest of the world shouldn't be reliant on the United States when it comes to military power and so on. Then Donald Trump might want to appease their voters. So having South Korea being an independent, strong, powerful force means that they disempower that argument. Donald Trump can continue to support them. And America probably don't want any more enemies with nuclear power, so it's probably probably likely the United States will stand by South Korea. This is not only good in terms of the security of South Korea, but also their position in global politics in order for them to continuously become strong. We think that's very important. But lastly, let's talk about South Korea's internal political stability. Because we think at the moment South Korea isn't the most stable when it comes to their internal politics. The impeachment of Park Geun-hye means that it creates a lot of uncertainty as well as a lot of fear within South Korea as to the continuous future of Korea. This also means that it can turn politics more hawkish because of the fear created and turn people to the extreme. That means that rather than reacting with reasonable political means, a lot more people might turn to aggression and might believe that that's more likely. So as opposed to favoring reunification with North Korea, a lot of people might think that active aggression might be a good thing. But if they believe that they are secure when it comes to security and are not worried that maybe President-elect Donald Trump might leave them, given people are very speculative when it comes to Donald Trump, it's important that then internal politics wouldn't turn hawkish and you maintain them to be very stable. We're extremely proud to propose.
I apologize in advance that I may not be able to clap at the right intervals. I would strongly advise all teams to just keep their own time as well. Sorry about that. All right, thank you so much. First speaker for the opening up.
Madam Speaker, at opening opposition, we are not going to claim that we have a window into the minds of two of the most misunderstood men in the world, Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. But our case will be simple. It is that the reason North Korea has nuclear weapons is for two reasons. Firstly, it's a show of bravado that gives North Korea a degree of leverage on the international stage. That does not mean there's an intention to use them. The second reason is it plays into the internal narrative of North Korean politics of the idea that Kim Jong-un is a god. Both of those are reasons as to why, rationally, Kim Jong-un might have nuclear weapons, but reasons as to why there's not necessarily a huge threat that needs to be addressed in this debate. With that in mind, I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, why the status quo provides an adequate degree of security such that there's not a need for this policy. And then secondly, more directly, why this hugely exacerbates tensions in the regions, which is going to be terrible for all countries involved. Rebuttal will be integrated. The first thing I want to respond to in extraneous material is this idea that Trump is more likely to support North Korea because they'll be seen as a strong ally now. The first response to that is Trump himself has said that he wants to bolster the US's nuclear arsenal. We largely think that he's not concerned about the degree of strength of his allies, but largely with American strength. But more importantly, Madam Speaker, I'm going to prove to you why Trump will continue to support South Korea such that this argument is irrelevant in this debate. So let's move to that first point. As I've already said, the reasons North Korea has nuclear weapons can to some extent be cast as rational. What are the two mitigating factors under the status quo which prevent them from using them? The first one is that China is a North Korean ally and essentially is able to whisper into the ear of Kim Jong-un such that there's a degree of leverage from China which will prevent North Korea from doing anything too hasty. The reason that's true is because China doesn't want North Korea to do something risky because that would create a refugee crisis on the border of China if the North Korean population was attacked back because they'd all be trying to flood through the northern border. The second reason is, and this is going to be important in this debate, here are the reasons. Well, currently South Korea has the support of the United States regime. Keep in mind, the US has nuclear submarines in literally every ocean, probably not around New Zealand, but everywhere else around the world. Those missiles are able to be utilized by South Korea, and the North Korean regime knows that, which is why they themselves won't use nuclear weapons. What are the reasons as to why North Korea, the US rather, will continue to support South Korea? The first one is that Russia and China are different countries. They just conflated the two. Trump has said about China that they are currency devaluers and basically that they're challenging US dominance on a global scale. Point to some examples of where Trump has been conciliatory towards China. When China recently grabbed a US naval drone, Trump was saying they can't do that, that's an illegitimate act and they've taken something that's property of the United States. No indications on the global stage that Trump is going to adopt a positive position towards North Korea. Secondly, Trump himself has said that he wants to increase the United States' nuclear arsenal. The reason he would do that, presumably, is to increase the US's strength in relation to China as the rising global force, and also North Korea as a despotic regime which he has publicly pronounced to be bad. So those are reasons as to why Trump will continue that relationship with South Korea as one of the United States' oldest allies, and also one that gives it that voice in Asia which it's held for a very long time. Closing.
Great, so another reason that you increase your nuclear arsenal is because a nuclear umbrella allows people like Trump, who have pledged to do so, to pull out troops from places like South Korea while still protecting
protecting your own people, even if you have no intention to ever nuke another country in its defense.
Yeah, sure. So that is true, but it's also not mutually exclusive with what we're saying, right? So he can pull out troops, but he can still support South Korea through the most powerful deterrent of all, which is a nuclear weapon. Because if you actually think about it, if North Korea uses a nuclear weapon, South Korea doesn't respond by sending troops over the border, it responds by nuking them back, right? So if we can prove that Trump continues to support through nuclear forces South Korea, that wins the point, because it's not about whether or not they have troops. Those two things are not mutually exclusive in this debate, and we can't let them be conflated. Secondly, why does this increase tensions in the region? Firstly, right now, as I've already said, North Korea has these weapons as a show of force. What is the message of this policy? Keeping in mind that the context we've been given is one of a fractious South Korean politics where we're generally seeing a populist uprising through the impeachment of the president, which we've seen. How is North Korea going to perceive this message? This will be perceived as a direct threat that with the message that South Korea has some degree of intention to use these weapons, because that is the only way this message can be constructed through the eyes of the North Korean regime, given that they already have access to the support of the US, like I've already said in this debate. So if we're talking about risks of nuclear weapons being used, unstable regimes tend to be at their most unstable when they have a direct threat in the eyes of the people and in the eyes of the controlling party, and that is an implication of this policy. The second reason is how China responds to this, right? Because China has an intention to be the hegemon in the region. Currently, their relationship with North Korea is this. They are tacit allies in the sense that they're able to whisper in their ear and encourage them not to do anything stupid, but also they don't have direct control over the regime. The reason this policy is problematic is because what China can say to North Korea right now is, we don't want you to use nuclear weapons because currently, the South Korean regime itself hasn't given you any indications that it's going to do that, it's going to engage in anything stupid. But that changes under this policy, right? Because at the point where South Korea starts to develop nuclear weapons, China can't then say to Kim Jong-un, actually there's no threat, you don't need to worry about anything, because Kim Jong-un is just going to say, the country on our border is literally developing nuclear weapons. What on earth is the reason they're doing that for? The only reason they must be doing that is because they have some degree of intention to use it, and that's why it's going to be terrible in that sense, because China can't give that message to Kim Jong-un. The other reason is they're more likely to encourage North Korea to develop nuclear weapons. The reason for that is because it's twofold. Firstly, they'll perceive it as a threat to themselves, and they want to have that degree of deterrence from the North Korean side. That makes it more likely that North Korea is going to do something risky if we accept there's a degree of irrationality from any leader who's in the position that Kim Jong-un is in. The second reason is, keep in mind that nuclear weapons programs are developed over time, so you don't just develop nuclear weapons overnight. That means that China will want to amp up the pressure on South Korea between the time that South Korea announces it's developing weapons and between the time that the weapons are developed, because it will want them to stop. It will want South Korea to stop developing those weapons. That means that tensions are likely to get very high in the short term, because China will be encouraging North Korea to develop weapons in response in the hope that South Korea will stop doing the same thing. So if there's a risk of a nuclear threat in this debate, it is in that time period when irrationality and populist pressures are likely to be highest. The current messaging and safety valve that China provides is lessened. It's more likely that missiles are going to be used. The status quo adequately defends against anything crazy on behalf of North Korea, and there is absolutely no need for this policy.
Alright, thank you so much. The Deputy Prime Minister, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, this debate is made or broken on a premise, which is whether the states will actually retract its support from South Korea in this particular circumstance. In my speech, the first half will be in dealing with why we think it's exceptionally likely that the United States will actually pull back its support, and secondly, even in the instance that it doesn't, ladies and gentlemen, why the internal politics that Jasmine talked about in her speech was exceptionally important, lack of response from the leader of opposition and will be fatal to the opening opposition's case. The first thing I want to do that doesn't fit into these two issues is first, I think that the opening opposition overplays the influence that China has or the incentives that China has in this particular circumstance. The first is that they assert that they required South Korea to develop nuclear weapons in order to feel like they wanted to support North Korea, or North Korea needed South Korea to develop nuclear weapons in order to tell China, hey, they're a danger. You know what exists right now? The nuclear umbrella. That means they still use that argument in regards to saying that there was a nuclear threat of them attacking us right now anyway. Secondly, China already has many incentives in terms of pressuring South Korea right now, whether it be when it comes to land grabs, when it comes to economic incentives, ladies and gentlemen, or whether it be dominance in the region, as you say, that they want to be a hegemon in the region on this side of the house. They already have plenty of incentives, and they already are under the status quo, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think the incentive changes. But unfortunately, opening opposition wasn't charitable enough to deal with the circumstance. What if the United States of America, given how unpredictable Donald Trump is in this particular circumstance, decides to even hint at an uncertainty, ladies and gentlemen, and as being the most generous to the opening opposition in regards to the support that they have for South Korea. Never wanted to deal with the emboldenment that China might have in terms of pressuring South Korea in that particular circumstance, or emboldening North Korea in regards to the kind of aggressive action they might take in that particular circumstance as well, ladies and gentlemen. At the very least, we're charitable enough on the outside house to deal with the circumstances that they've talked about, never once wanting to entertain the situation where America might in some uncertainty pull back given Donald Trump's nature in this particular debate. Secondly, I want to deal with the characterization of Donald Trump, because I think this will make or break whether or not Donald Trump is likely to pull back support in this particular circumstance. First and foremost, I think it's important to note the personal characteristics of Donald Trump. That first and foremost, economic personal interest oftentimes also becomes a blinder to what kind of policies that Donald Trump wants to enact. Whether it be the millions of dollars that he has to Chinese state-owned companies, ladies and gentlemen, or the debt he owns to Russian state-owned companies, and it's dubious at best, ladies and gentlemen, whether he will even separate himself from the companies that he owns right now, ladies and gentlemen, means that the moral character that we would typically expect of an American president isn't existent with the president that we have at the moment right now, ladies and gentlemen. Given that even his policy seems to respond to lots of the personal interest and personal wealth accumulation that we've talked about in this particular circumstance, it seems very likely that he determines much of his personal or policy interest, ladies and gentlemen, based on his personal interest in this particular circumstance. But secondly, even to the extent that we believe that on this side house, that Donald Trump will not act on those personal interests, we can see throughout history that he's been incredibly unpredictable according to the political circumstance. Many months ago, he was incredibly hawkish against President Putin, ladies and gentlemen, because President Putin didn't want to cooperate with the United States of America when it came to the peace deal in Aleppo. But right now, apparently they're kumbaya best friends, tweeting each other and sending them nightly texts across each other, ladies and gentlemen. And apparently, ladies and gentlemen, there's no long lost enemies, because apparently when Donald Trump makes enemies out of Republicans very similarly makes allies of them later on as well, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, the opening object cannot give us a clear analysis as to whether or not we can actually predict the loyalties of Donald Trump on this side of us, especially in the instance when you have Donald Trump stacking his cabinet with many individuals that have either compromised economic interests or even actually were in bed with, for example, Russian oil companies in this particular circumstance. Even Russia is a particular threat, given that Russia is an incredibly close ally of China, and Russia being able to whisper in the ear of Donald Trump also seems to be a conflict of interest in terms of whether or not it'll be as hawkish as he says towards China in this particular circumstance. But lastly, ladies and gentlemen, we think that South Korea just isn't important enough for Donald Trump in order to risk a trade war or actual war with China in this particular circumstance. You're right. If, for example, somebody gets nuked in that particular region, refugees will flood over to China. China will be extremely unhappy. And protecting South Korea in that particular circumstance, when you acknowledge that China cannot control North Korea in this particular circumstance as well, means that Donald Trump is more likely to believe that protecting or placing placing South Korea under the nuclear umbrella, or as the closing government point out, placing troops in those particular areas is an incredible risk that we would rather not take in this circumstance. Donald Trump can say many tough words about China, but very often, ladies and gentlemen, he prioritizes personal economic interests or the home interest of America rather than actually going to war. Most of the time, he's promised not to actually engage in war, like pulling out of NATO because people aren't carrying their weight, ladies and gentlemen. I think because of those characterizations, I think it's incredibly likely that at best on your side, it's uncertain, or at worst, there's actually a pullback in support for the enemies of South Korea under outside house. You need to actually respond. Yes, sir.
If Donald Trump is uncertain, that is also a reason as to why North Korea wouldn't do anything hasty, because they would be taking an enormous risk. That doesn't contradict our case.
Look, come on. Like, a lot of times, Kim Jong-un literally just made Christmas illegal and already makes, for example, 5th nuclear test when already the governments the world over have threatened them with sanctions and all that, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, he's a rational actor that restores a personal interest, but clearly he's not the brightest bulb in the bunch, right? So I'm not entirely sure that North Korea has ever responded in that particular way and being timid towards, for example, the uncertainty in America. Typically in foreign relations, uncertainty is an excuse for emboldenment because you're unsure whether your enemy actually still has the protection that they still have in this particular circumstance. But now that I've dealt with that particular context, even if Donald Trump doesn't pull their particular support, ladies and gentlemen, the political instability that we've talked about is widespread. Considering that in the political climate, where even, ladies and gentlemen, the Senori party where Park Geun-hye is from, ladies and gentlemen, is already incredibly divided when it comes to unification or even peace with North Korea given its aggression, ladies and gentlemen, even the slightest bit of uncertainty given the gaffes, tweets, or many different times that Donald Trump speaks out of both ends of his mouth, ladies and gentlemen, in next year being an election year, it is incredibly important to note that political sentiments are all-time high and extremism is incredibly likely on this side of the house. It is more likely you get people pulled to the right and being more extremist, more hawkish like Jasmine talked about. We provide characterization as to why that's true. There's absolutely no response from the opening opposition as to why that's not a risk you would rather want to stabilize by telling South Korean people that you can protect yourself, you don't need to worry, and you can continue on the path of reunification and peace, ladies and gentlemen. I'm exceptionally proud to propose.
Well, coming into this world, or even 3 months ago, if you told me that I would be in a debate where someone would tell the judges that what will make or break whether they win this debate is if they can convince you that Donald Trump is more and more favourable to China, I would have called you a liar, ladies and gentlemen. I think this is quite an easy burden for us to prove, and so I'm going to spend slightly less than the 6 minutes Mifzal spent on it, but still a considerable amount of time talking about why Donald Trump indeed will not be the ally of China that he claims in this debate. I'm then going to move on and talk more broadly about what the path forward currently looks like, the actions China takes, the actions South Korea are likely to take, and then secondly I'm going to look in a separate area of this debate at what it looks like in the world of a nuclear South Korea, specifically looking at North Korean aggression, how they act directly as a result of this, and how other countries like Japan act as well. Let's firstly look at what the path forward looks like. In terms of the US, first of all, that was the big actor they wanted to set this debate in the context of. They tell us that Trump is essentially telling allies to stand alone. No, thank you, it's too late for that. And that therefore he's going to be withdrawing support from South Korea. We told you that that would be empowering China and North Korea, and as a result he is unlikely to do that. What does Mifzal say when he starts to make this argumentation a little more subtle at second? He tells us, well, Donald Trump owes a lot of money to China, right? So he's going to want to do things that make China as favourable as possible to him. I'm sceptical of this for a couple of reasons. Number one, he also has significant investments in South Korea. So at the point that you withdraw support, the first time a US president has done that in literally decades, that is likely to be something that's going to make those investments worth even less. No, thank you. Second of all, we think he has re-election plans, right? And when he's campaigned on a platform of telling the US population the big hegemonic battle of this century is the US versus China, and then becomes friends with China because apparently he has investments there, we think that's something that massively diminishes those re-election plans and those prospects of re-election. We think the incentives, therefore, to take a drastic stance such as an anti-South Korean stance, which is what a withdrawal would be perceived as, are incredibly low for Donald Trump. We don't have to, on our side of the house, say he has to be actively aggressive towards China in order to continue the status quo, right? He just has to be silent and continue what is currently happening. He just has to leave the current missiles that are there in order to continue the deterrent that they said has historically been successful. So we think if you take the choice that would be more easy for Donald Trump and more prudent for Donald Trump, it would be to a continuation of the status quo and a continuation of what has happened for the last several decades in terms of that relationship. The other thing I want to point out here is that there are a lot of practical elements of the deterrent that actually will remain regardless of the stance on South Korea, because the deterrent towards North Korea are things like actual physical missiles being placed and having naval bases in various countries. Those are the types of things that remain for other reasons as part of the US's overall pivot towards Asia, which are things like creating a deterrent towards Chinese military expansion. So the presence of those things can be argued for those reasons without necessarily continuing to make the South Korean justification for their presence. No, thank you. Finally, he tells us, look, at best, what you guys prove is that there is uncertainty. What James points out in a point of information I want to develop further here is that Trump being unpredictable and uncertainty in terms of his stance on South Korea is likely to be enough, even in our worst case scenario, for North Korea to not take action. Why? Because if Trump has an ambiguous stance in terms of this relationship, at the point that North Korea start to attack South Korea or make aggressive movements towards them, if Trump did not respond to that in an aggressive way or at least rebuke it, right, that would be seen as essentially acceding to indirect Chinese expansionism within the region. We think that's something which Trump is excessively unlikely to do, and for those reasons, the fundamental premise of the opening government's case falls out of this debate. On that grounds, because it's fallen out, you can sit down and I'll hear from you.
Great, so Trump hasn't campaigned to defeat China militarily about its territorial expansion. He wants to defeat it economically, which is why it can simultaneously leave South Korea, but also get into a trade war with it that South Korea needs to defend itself against.
Absolutely right, but if you expand your territory within a region, if you are the hegemon within your region, you can dominate them economically by, for example, creating free trade agreements such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. If China becomes more powerful as part of that and therefore can essentially dominate the Asian region economically, then that plays into that narrative as well. We think military expansionism and economic expansionism are one and the same thing in the vast majority of cases, and so Trump's interests are aligned there. What do China currently do? We say, and they do moderate the actions that North Korea take. Mifzal tells us that, well, China are already opposed to South Korea, so they already do things that are contrary to that being the case. That is true, but it is limited to the extent to which, no thank you, the extent to which they are going to do that. Why? Because China benefit from some degree of stability within the region. If there is a conflict on the Korean border, that is something that China do not benefit from. So because of the fact that economically it's harmful to them, but also the fact that they're likely to have there's a potential for a rush of migrants from North Korea into their country, something which they don't want. That means that as a result, they have an incentive to make sure that North Korean regime is pacified, but that they're satisfied, but that they're not taking such aggressive stance that there's instability within the region. We think that's something which is a strong incentive on China to continue the stance they've taken over the past decades to make sure that Korean expansionism isn't as extreme as it could be under this policy. And so what does that policy look like? The first thing I want to point out is that their argument about South Korean internal politics actually works for us in this debate, because uncertainty within South Korean politics plays into the sort of comment James made about the naivety of the assumption on this side of the house that you click your fingers one day and get economic weapons. Nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are developed over many, many years. What that means is if there's uncertainty and instability within South Korean political system, other countries such as North Korea and China, the point that they begin a nuclear program will think, if we act aggressively now, we can use the uncertainty to influence the South Korean political system such that nuclear program is rolled back or postponed or just slowed down or made
made smaller. So in that respect, we think the South Korean instability and the political framework that they said was a minor premise of their case is actually something that works for us. We think Japan is also likely to become more nationalistic and as a result of this. At the point that they become the one large country in the region who doesn't have nuclear weapons, they're more likely to therefore act aggressively, maybe develop their own nuclear weapons. That in turn causes more instability between China and those countries, particularly in areas such as the Senkaku Islands disputes. Those are all things which create instability, which ultimately harm South Korea both economically and in terms of their security. Incredibly proud to oppose on those grounds.
Alright, thank you so much. That concludes the open half, inviting the member of government to the front.
It's not part of the trend anymore.
We will be the team in this debate that engages with opening opposition in its best case. That is one in which North Korea poses a severe and imminent nuclear threat. In particular, 2 points of extension. One is we're going to convince you that there is an imminent North Korean nuclear threat in this particular case. We think opening government did a good job of discussing some of the details here. If we want to add a temporal aspect and explain why in this particular case right now, South Korea is in a particularly precarious situation. Second of all, we will expand the debate beyond South Korean interests in particular and explain why we think regional balance is much better on our side of the house given the long-term trajectory of that region. We think opening government kind of touched on this, but we think ultimately the important thing that we're adding is we think that South Korea has an important role to play in ensuring regional stability overall. First, though, then, the first point, imminence of a nuclear threat from North Korea, the rebuttal to opening opposition will be integrated here. So the first thing to say on this is we think that the line that opening opposition and in general front half has taken has been somewhat unnuanced. That is to say, we think the more specific and accurate characterization of whether or not Trump will or will not support China and therefore South Korea is that Trump cares about a particular good, and that is economic interests. That is to say that Trump can say that he will accept a Chinese sphere of influence, i.e. not oppose them geopolitically, but very fervently, as opening opposition points out in all of their examples, oppose them upon economic lines. This seems to be exactly the sort of thing that he campaigned on. He cares about currency manipulation, the taking of American jobs, not the fact that, for example, Taiwan is something that is subject to the one China policy. In fact, we think that was a great example of this. He can call Taiwan, but then signal later that he still might support the one China policy in exchange for concessions that have to do economically. I think that demonstrates why the nuance of our position is the more accurate one when it comes to this particular ground. Now I'm going to respond to opening opposition's points here. So they first say, in response to our POI, that obviously territory and economic interests are linked. Yes, that is true if you are a candidate, no, that believes in a free trade world. That is to say, if you believe that you trade in the region is how you get economic interests, i.e. the TPP, then you might believe that, but that is clearly not the position that Trump has taken. Again, we would say, we point to the things that he actually cares about, currency manipulation, the taking of American jobs. Those are anti-trade positions that still take a particular economic position. No. The other thing they say, which we found quite ludicrous, was to say that Trump has hotels in South Korea, and that will be the basis of his foreign policy decision there. Like, look, even at some point they need to get realistic. They say themselves, Trump cares about re-election. It's clearly not going to be the tipping point with respect to that. The last thing they say is that they say Trump campaigned to defeat China. Look, as we already told you, Trump campaigned on a very specific way in which he would defeat China, on the basis of the scorecard of the trade deficit, on the taking of American jobs. That is specifically having to do with the economic interests that we identify and not the sort of geopolitical mess that opening half waded into. At this point then, I think it's pretty clear what the position is. We will get withdrawal from that region with respect to South Korea because it is not linked to that economic agenda that Trump outlines. That's why we think our conception, no, is the best. The other thing to say in response to opening opposition is that they say that a North Korean threat would never happen because, and they have one argument for this, China cares a lot about the refugee crisis that would happen if North Korea were threatened. First of all, China can close its border. That stretch of land is like one part of like the millions and millions of miles that are out of China. And as European countries seem to have done pretty successfully, it is quite possible for countries to simply close their borders. China has no problem in using the military force that is necessary to ensure that. But second of all, let's weaponize this argument. Their argument is only true that North Korea would not be a threat to South Korea if it's the case that there is a credible response. In the past, that credible response has been the United States. When we have withdrawal, as we've explained, on the basis of economic interests, as we've explained, it is no longer the case that that credible response exists, which is why some countervailing force needs to happen. We are the only side in this debate that provides that countervailing force. No. Now here's where we explain why we think the threat is particularly imminent. Deepening the analysis from opening government, we think that's what makes this point successful. North Korea has a curious habit of testing new leaders, and that is what we think signs of aggression actually occur. We would point to the fact that the nuclear test they identified happened 2 weeks before Park Geun-hye's inauguration. That means that in this particular case, the fact that the president is being impeached, that there'll be new elections, is a sign that this is the window in which North Korea is likely to project that aggression. No, but we also think another important fact here is that when you have U.S. withdrawal, you have withdrawal from the THAAD system. That is to say, the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System. No one talked about this. This was explicitly in Trump's campaign speeches. He said he did not support that. He does not want to give money to that defense system. That is literally the system that defends against a nuclear threat. And the fact that we no longer have that means it's especially important that we have a response. That is, again, our side of the house. The last thing we also say is that there's an important intelligence sharing deal on that region between Japan and South Korea that just barely passed Parliament with the support of the Sanjaya party. Now that that party is fracturing on the basis of this impeachment, it is not likely that you will have that deal actually passed and then go into effect, which is why in this particular case we also see particular military precariousness. That's why we think that a response is the most important thing for the short-term existential threat nature of South Korea. That's exactly what our side of the house gives you. Closing.
Can Trump realistically be a successful president if he engages in actions which hugely alienate large chunks of congressional Republicans?
Yes, it's clear that the people that are support, like the primary, everyone opposed him, and the people that are supporters care about a particular thing. He has taken those positions. The question is, what are the positions he'll take in the future? It's very likely the ones that we outline on the basis of the incentives that we outline. Cool. Now, long-term regional stability. Look, we think that a nuclear umbrella in that region is important because it means that that region is able to ensure stability for all the countries. We think South Korea, in developing nuclear weapons, can be that country because it's the case that other countries also care about the Chinese threat. We have ASEAN nations. We have Japan. And the fact that a country like South Korea has the ability to develop nuclear weapons means that it can shore protection and push back against that other side of the alliance within that region, i.e. China. So why is it the case that we think that the US is withdrawing and China is being particularly aggressive? The things we point to here are military threats, like the fact that the Diaoyu Islands, which are just off of the coast of South Korea, actually have anti-aircraft missiles put on them by Korea. We think that economic threats are particularly imminent. We point to the fact that now that the TPP is dead, that the RCEP, China's counterpoint to that, is now in effect. And as such, South Korea, which is previously party to the TPP, must now negotiate into the RCEP. If it wants favorable terms, if it does not want to be shut out the economic future of that region, it needs to be able to engage in stronger negotiations. The other thing is that we also think that on the basis of this economic interest, you are likely to see a trade war between the US and China. Right now, China must allow its current. What happens with Chinese currency is that there's a huge demand for American financial instruments on the basis of Chinese investors. And the reason that happens, and that ultimately means that people in China who are powerful are pissed off. That means that those people now, as a demand for allowing the currency to float, which to the US looks like currency devaluation. That is exactly the sort of thing that pushes Trump to promote a trade war. And when that happens, it's the case that you now have other Chinese aggression. We would point to Chinese aggression too with respect to the WTO. They were not granted Chinese market status economy, and as a result of that, they have huge penalties to pay as a result of dumping. Those are exactly the sorts of signs that we see leading to a trade war in the future. That is a trade war that will implicate not just South Korea, but other nations in that region. We need some sort of pushback, and as we told you, our side of the house is the only one that can guarantee that.
The two premises that the government bench rested their case on were A, that Trump is likely to withdraw, and B, if Trump does withdraw, the correct response for South Korea was to obtain nuclear weapons in response. What we're going to demonstrate from closing opposition is that both of those things are simply untrue. Before I do that, and before the second piece of extension as well about inflating the region as a whole, I have two pieces of rebuttal. First of all, closing government suggests that Trump only cares about economic interests, and they point to things that he says as evidence of this. I would demonstrate he's also tweeted about China pulling a drone out of the water and being quite pissed about that quite recently. So we'd suggest he's also capable of being angry and irrational about military things as well. Second of all, they say that North Korea will test Kim Jong-un. This is the reason why they're particularly militaristic and dangerous now. I think they don't explain why testing Kim Jong-un is the same as being militarily aggressive or escalating to the point that an actual conflict arises. North Korea, we do not think, has any clear incentive that has ever been demonstrated by side government to actually begin a war, because that is probably the end of that regime, right? Because China, for instance, could not be seen to be propping up a state that just attacked a different peaceful actor on the international stage, and they would probably have to withdraw aid from that regime and end it at that point. And we think the elites in North Korea simply want to keep their cushy lives, right? They don't want an escalation or an inflammation. What they want is the status quo where they're rich and they're successful and they don't have any risk to their lives. First plank of extension, politics in the US. The core contention of the government bench were, as I said, A, that Trump is likely to withdraw, and B, that if the US, even if it does withdraw, the correct response is to build nukes. We disagree with both. On the first, we have the following 4 reasons why Trump is unlikely to militarily withdraw. First of all, we think that Trump has a huge incentive to militarily curtail North Korea. Allowing North Korea to continue to develop its nuclear program leads to the future threat of it developing long-range ballistic missiles, right? Things that cannot just target South Korea, but the US states as well. That is something that is an existential threat for US voters, and something that forces him politically to go after the North Korean industry and impose the sanctions that opening government said were sometimes effective, to impose pressure on China, which they accept is sometimes effective, and do the sorts of things that militarily push back against North Korea, and also to project a strong presence in the region to signal to North Korea that we are not going to let you continue with this. Second of all, it is difficult to withdraw troops, right? Inasmuch as there are treaty obligations the US has that a president cannot unilaterally withdraw, that mean there are military forces that have to be left in South Korea, right? That means there is always going to be a US military presence. They can't just abandon, right? The US just can't say, we're going to leave some troops there to die when we don't launch a nuke back if the North Korea attacks, right? They have to defend their troops. That's politically difficult to get around. Third of all, we think the political cost of this sort of policy is particularly difficult. Closing government say, of course he can do things without congressional support, right? Look at what happened to Obama trying to push through his agenda without having congressional support. It simply is impossible to get legislation through the Senate. It's impossible to get your Supreme Court justices confirmed. It's impossible to push things like big changes to the way the executive branch is structured if you want to do successful things. And here's the difficulty. The main branch of Republican congressional people in the Senate and Congress, for instance, are like mainstream center conservative hawkish people. They don't want to see US presence or military influence in the world diminished. And he has far more of an incentive to just bring those people on side so he can get other things he cares about more, like the economic stuff pushed through, rather than mindlessly alienating them for something that apparently is not very high on his agenda in any meaningful sense, as both government teams seem to suggest. Last of all, US expatriates, right? There is a very large US presence in South Korea, right? Allowing them to die would be the single biggest loss of US life since 9/11, right? We think it is unlikely that Trump would politically set himself up to be the US president who oversaw 9/11 Mark II, but by North Korea like the greatest axis of evil country in the world ever. That would seem to suggest he is likely to retain US presence and military influence in the region. To respond to opening government, their suggestion is that he's a bit dodgy and he's irrational and sometimes we can't trust him. I would point to one very important observation, right? Given that he doesn't have a lot of strong opinions that are apparently flexible, what he is likely to default to is the important people he's appointed as advisors militarily. The person he appointed to his cabinet as the Secretary of Defense was General Mathis, who is a mainstream hawk who believes the same tenets of projecting US power in the region and being a strong country that defends its allies. That means the person he's likely to default to, if he is irrational, is someone who believes in exactly the sort of defending South Korean stuff that opening government needed to be false for their case to have any stance. But let's presume for a second now that Trump is likely to or will withdraw. We think that, first of all, North Korea has no incentive to nuke South Korea or to engage aggressively, right? Because China would have to end the regime. The international response of most countries, often constitutionally, is to sanction A, both countries that are aggressors in war, and B, countries that are assisting countries that are aggressors in war. We think China would not be able to politically maintain its position on the global scale, for instance, if every other country in the world saw them as supporting or continuing to prop up a regime that had just committed an act of aggressive war in violation of every international norm and not took down a rogue state that was now one of the most dangerous players on the global stage. The likely consequence of that is that China would remove all the financial aid or collapse the regime. We think it has some capacity to do this, right? And we think that means that the North Korean elite, who are the ones who make these decisions at the end of the day, have no reason to allow this to come to pass. But second of all, let's understand where it is most likely that a conflict inflames. We think that nuclear conflicts or severe conflicts arise out of fear, right? They arise because people they fear as though they're going to be the ones attacked first, and therefore they need to preemptively do something, right? Now, notice that as both government teams accept, it is likely to be a time of particularly high tension, right? A time when the Kim Jong-un is being tested, so he probably puts the military on high alert, he probably invests more in the military, and people within that military are told, look, this is a particularly dangerous time, we need to be very, powerful in this thing. Here's the problem, right? The way in which a nuclear strike, for instance, is likely to come back is, say, a false detection, right? Where, say, improper or poorly funded North Korean nuclear targeting facilities detect that something is coming at them, they misjudge it as a nuclear missile, and they respond aggressively in response, right? They often misjudge things that they see. That's why they accidentally attack US vessels or South Korean vessels at times, because they don't have the sophisticated military capacity to actually understand what's coming at them. At the moment, the worst, I'll take you in a second, the worst the South can do to them is conventional warfare, right? Something they don't need to push the red button immediately to, because they always have a ladder response. If South Korea is nuclearly armed, they know that if they don't respond to something, then that could be existentially the end for them, right? So they have a far bigger incentive to push that button, sure.
Your only mitigation is that he wants to be re-elected or Republicans sit within chain. Given the anti-establishment sentiment that swept into power, allowing him to whip Republicans into lie or ignoring his cabinet, why wouldn't he be able to do the very same things when he's in power and then just go on abandoning his allies like his followers want?
Sure, he might be able to, but it would be hugely political and difficult and remove a lot of capital and capacity to do other things that he cares about more. I just don't think his highest priority is to say, fuck South Korea in particular and damage myself, where he could just equally do nothing and do all the things he cares about more, like economic things. Second of all, on politics, closing government stuff is a lot about regional information, right? And opening government suggests that one thing they want to do is to fulfill the narrative that US allies should pay for their defense from the US, right? I think this is horrific because it probably forces Japan to get nuclear weapons as well. A, because the Japanese government is nationalist, will be seen to need to be strong if South Korea is also doing this, and B, because you fulfill the narrative that you need to get nuclear weapons to get US support. The problem with this is that all of the harms that every team in this debate have accepted apply where one actor in the region get nuclear weapons applies with respect to China and Japan, right? Now China will feel there is a more aggressive and nuclear powerful Japan in the region and is likely to inflame tensions, damage economic relations, and hurt everyone in that region as a whole. So all of the harms that apply for generally pissing off people in the region apply more strongly when you strong-arm Japan into doing this thing as well. The two most important things in this debate were A, the response of Trump, and B, whether it was correct if he withdrew to obtain nuclear weapons. We proved both of those fell for our side, and that's why we oppose.
Everybody ready? First, I'm going to explain to you what's happened so far in this round and why CG is clearly going to win. Next, I'm going to talk about the short-term nuclear threat that North Korea poses. And finally, I'm going to talk about regional stability and long-term safety, which we get literally a 10-second response out of the member of opposition. I guess, in the next speech, we'll hear a bunch of stuff, maybe, like great responsiveness. So moving on. Contextualizing the round. OG gives a very reasonable case about why, in general, North Korea might pose a threat. Problems with this that we uniquely solve. One, it is not actually demonstrated and proved that North Korea will ever strike, right? There's a threat of nuclear weapons, and it's not particular, right? So it's not clear why this needs to happen now, or rather than later at another date. Second of all, they don't respond to the challenge from OO about the fact that China will never allow this to happen. Uniquely, Henry does that, and I will also include in this area of the debate responses to what we just hear. But finally, they never actually nuance for you the US interest, neither does opening opposition. We uniquely in this round have demonstrated that it is not simply pro-China, anti-China, but the ways in which they actually see their strength in the world and the voters that Trump relies on, not a couple of US senators or the words that he spouts in Twitter. Great. First area of the debate, short-term nuclear threat that North Korea poses. So we provide evidence that there is a very imminent threat that North Korea poses. So a couple of ways. So first of all, the fact that frequently North Korea engages in violent action and tests new presidents, right? So given the fact that Park Geun-hye is going to have to be replaced, and there's a lot of turbulence in South Korea, we think it is particularly likely that at that very moment, not generally they pose a threat, they are going to do something and are more likely to strike. Also, Henry gives you two additional pieces of evidence that Trump has credibly demonstrated a willingness to stop supporting the THAAD system, and that also intelligence sharing with Japan is going to go out the window, which means South Korea, even if the US is still there, will have no idea when a strike is coming, completely unresponded to by closing opposition. Next area of the debate, the challenge from OO and CO that China will never let this happen. So, a couple of responses that again go unresponded to. So Henry tells you they don't care about refugees because they can close their borders, right? It's not that big of a deal. But second of all, the refugee crisis only happens if North Korea nukes South Korea and someone responds. Who is responding in this world, right? The US is never going to nuke an ally of China just to protect South Korea, which it literally doesn't care about, right? I'll explain that in more depth later, but they've never actually demonstrated for you that key link that there will be a nuclear response. Now, what does CG say on this? They say that China won't allow it because they face international condemnation. The international condemnation would have been from the US, right? Like, who else is equally powerful in the international context to actually condemn them and do something about it? Like, oh yeah, the European Union getting together and being like, this was really shitty, definitely impacts China to a great degree. Like, no, they are forming rival international institutions that do not rely on the US, do not rely on European support. Their goals of international and regional hegemony are not countered by the very actors that they say would object to this. So this is totally underwarranted, and I guess we will never get a chance to respond to an actually good form of the argument. Moving on to the next, Moving on, the last area and the final challenge is what U.S. interests are and whether, I will take you after this section, so stop please, what U.S. interests actually are. So we tell you it's economic interests. Now, the response we get from opening opposition is like, guys, if you have territory, you get lots of trade deals. Like, yes, we understand. That would matter if the TPP weren't dead letter on a page in the US Senate, right? Trump was elected because he opposes the very type of economic deals that they say he will lose out on. What Trump stands for is economic independence, right? So he doesn't care if China takes over South Korea. He doesn't care if China takes over Taiwan, as he has illustrated by first calling Taiwan and then publicly saying he would trade support for them for China stopping to manipulate their currency, right? Like, guess what? The yuan does not become harder to manipulate or easier if they take over South Korea, right? They have never engaged with what the actual economic incentives of Trump are. What does CG say? They say Trump is really pissed about the drone out of the water. Like, yeah, Twitter and what he says about a drone is not as indicative of the people who elected him, right? Trump in his campaign speech and the states that voted for him are old industrial places that have lost jobs because of trade deals that sent manufacturing overseas, right? So yeah, Trump says a lot of shit. Some of it will work for either side of this debate. The things that actually matter are the interests of his constituency, which is to fight China, not in terms of trade and capture trade deals, but to fight currency manipulation and make the US as economically independent as possible. Next, they say North Korea becomes a nuclear threat. That is why my POI from earlier becomes relevant. That is why Trump has a huge nuclear umbrella, right? Because he can respond. That's why the US has anti-missile systems so that he can respond. You know what you don't need to prevent that? Troops in South Korea responding to nuclear attacks on South Korea. This isn't an argument for their side. But next they say treaty obligations. Yeah, the treaties get renegotiated or canceled, as will happen during his term. Finally, they say there's a political cost. Again, voters, the very same voters that elect senators, support him. Opening.
The development of nuclear weapons takes multiple years and invariably ebbs and flows. given you told us that North Korea is most aggressive when there is South Korean instability, won't they use the current instability in South Korea to influence a rollback of this nuclear program via aggression?
Yeah, so maybe that happens if you're starting from ground zero. We think there are clearly, given it is a highly developed nation, nuclear scientists that could create nuclear weapons rapidly if they needed to. Great. Final area of the debate that goes woefully unresponded to. Another reason that we are really important is because we respond to the world in which North Korea never nukes South Korea. Great. We still think them having a nuclear weapon is incredibly important. Henry explains to you that China is also a huge threat in this region. They have demonstrated this through arming built islands. They have demonstrated this through threats of a trade war with the United States. What happens to South Korea and the rest of the area if a trade war or other aggression evolves, right? They have no one to defend them given US withdrawal, or they're at the mercy of one country or another. South Korea has a unique opportunity to offer a security umbrella to other states, which gets a collective action against the regional hegemon that all teams in this round seem to think is a huge risk, even if North Korea doesn't strike. We uniquely explain the key parts of this debate and operate in all logical frameworks. Very proud to propose.
Last speaker of this debate, Paul Whitney.
Oh, can I have your time? Look, I think if you're going to start the government whip by lambasting Zhang for being unresponsive, it's probably quite bad form to then miss the key plank of his extension. Namely, that if South Korea gets nuclear weapons, that ratchets up the fear within the North Korean government. That means there is more likely that there will be an accidental confrontation when someone doesn't understand what's going on, when the North Koreans are particularly scared, or even the South Koreans are particularly scared, because nuclear weapons are messy and chaotic, and we ultimately think that that is the worst thing that could possibly happen to the region, right? Because huge numbers of people will die, and that outweighs instability in South Korea, that outweighs its ability to cope with a trade war, right? Even if we only prove that there is an increase by 10% of a nuclear confrontation happening, we win this debate because that's so horrific. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, North Korean incentives right now, why it isn't going to attack the South. Secondly, Trump, why we prove he's not going to withdraw. Thirdly, consequences in terms of ratcheting up fear, not just within the Korean Peninsula, but Asia overall. Let's jump straight into it. No. John gives you a number of explanations why currently North Korea has no incentive to attack the South. Firstly, simply because North Korean elites don't want huge amounts of instability. They live a reasonably happy, comfortable life. This is not a particularly ideological regime at the top. It's a means of extracting money and power and comfort for its leaders. We are unclear why it strengthens the North Korean regime to launch a devastating nuclear attack on South Korea, right? Because presumably that will destabilize the region, there'll be radiation seeping into the north, there'll be refugees from the south coming into the north. Unclear why it's in anyone's interest. What do they say? On this?
No. They say, well, North Korea often needs to test South Korea to show it's strong and macho at times of political change. Sure. So maybe because of all the instability in South Korea, the North can use conventional means, like it always has done in the past, so things like shelling South Korea, etc., to show it's strong, to test the South Korean regime, right? We think that better fits in with the incentives that North Korean elites actually have than a nuclear strike. No one on government proved that it would be in the interest of North Korea to launch a nuclear strike, even if there were no consequences. But John gave you a number of substantial consequences to this, right? He said, firstly,
know that this is going to provoke a very bad international response. Evan says, the Europeans, irrelevant. It doesn't matter if they're annoyed. I mean, it probably does, right? Because the European Union is a key trading partner. It is likely to impose sanctions on China if it is seen to allow the North Koreans to do this. But moreover, China wants to project itself as a great power. It wants to be seen as diplomatically important. It also doesn't want to scare the Japanese so much that the Japanese government rearms and becomes more belligerent. We think those are all reasons why China is likely to hinder the North Koreans launching a nuclear attack. But finally, even if you don't buy that, and even if you buy, which I'm going to defeat later, that Trump has withdrawn US troops from South Korea, we think there is still a risk that the US will respond militarily to this, right? Because recognise that there will still be a US embassy in Seoul, there will still be large numbers of US interests and US civilians in Seoul. The effect of a nuclear strike will be the biggest loss of lives since 9/11. Trump is someone who cares about currency manipulation, but not at the cost of a wipeout of US civilians akin to Pearl Harbor. That will provoke a US response even if the troops are gone. If me and John can figure that out in 15 minutes of prep, we think the North Korean regime can probably figure that out now. But, moreover, we think that Trump isn't going to withdraw, right? And so a lot of the harms they claim will happen don't apply. Why? It's not just because of what personally motivates Trump, but it's because of the analysis John gives you about Trump's political incentives. Firstly, while we concede he is somewhat isolationist, it is still in that isolationist interest to constrain North Korea because there is a risk of it developing ICBMs which could be used to strike at California. Right? No response from Evan, but we think that is a reason why Trump will care enough to stay strong and to maintain a strong presence in South Korea specifically. In terms of whether he cares about currency manipulation, again, he probably does care about currency manipulation. He's probably wanting to do a deal with China. But we think there are other things he can trade away that are easier for him to do so, right? So we think potentially Trump can cut all contact with the Tibetans. He can stop pestering the Chinese about their human rights abuses. And that's a bargaining chip which gets a deal on currency manipulation without the harms of withdrawal from South Korea that John told you about. What are those harms, right? Those harms are that he is going to alienate a large number of politically vital Republicans in the Senate and in Congress who are going to be hugely angry to the notion of giving up South Korea to China, to the North, aside from the fact that it also damages Trump's own nationalist rhetoric. How is that so important? Because if Trump wants to be successful, he needs to actually carry policies through. It's correct that he rose to power on a wave of anti-elite sentiment, but it was premised on the notion that I will get things done. I will get that wall built, I will get those Supreme Justices in, I will be able to get a budget passed, and crucially, I won't face a primary challenge in 2020. He imperils all those things when he alienates a large chunk of the Republican majority, if he does that. Closing.
Great. So thankfully, half of my speech was spent on an entire other plane of existence in this round, in which there are regional reasons why, even if North Korea is eliminated, it is still in the safety of millions of people for South Korea to have a nuke. All of this material is clearly outweighed.
No, and I'm going to get onto that now. Final thing on Trump, right? Many of his advisors, who he probably listens to more, for instance Mattis, who changed his mind on torture, are pro-non-withdrawal. But let's talk about the international consequences. No, you didn't take any of our POIs. In terms of the international consequences, we think the consequence of the South Koreans obtaining a nuclear weapon is that the North Korean elites are going to genuinely fear an attack from South Korea. Right? They are genuinely going to fear that the South will attack, particularly as, even though North Korea has nuclear weapons, as John told you, if the South attacks them, that means those nuclear weapons are wiped out, right? So that means they can't strike back if they are victims of attack, right? That means that any risk that a heightened North Korean officer, who's more scared about the South, sees like even a bird flying over and assumes that's a nuclear weapon, the risks of a nuclear attack happening increase dramatically. There's also the risk that that happens in other countries because the North feels under so much pressure to strike now. In terms of whether South Korea needs this in order to protect itself against bullying from China, one, it's a harm we are willing to absorb into our case, but actually we think that South Korea can protect itself via A, the shield that the US provides, but B, if South Korea is concerned about a trade war with China, recognise that this is exactly the kind of thing that China doesn't want because it's going to up tensions in the region, it's going to make North Korea more belligerent, right? So you think if it's in South Korea's interest that as CG claim it has to do a trade deal with China, it probably shouldn't get a nuclear weapon in the first place. John proved to you this significantly increases the risk of nuclear war. He gave the best analysis of what truly motivates the North Korean regime and why the US is going to remain. But even if that's not true, we win on the risk of war and regional stability. That's why we are incredibly proud to oppose.